Hello and welcome to Mrs. Dinkelbet's Bedtime Stories for Studying Subliminally. Today I'd like to take you to Reforming the Spirit. I'm going to set the scene now. Between the 1820s and the 1860s, a wide variety of reform movements sprang up to improve conditions in the United States of America. Two reporters entered the small, ordinary-looking brick hut. Opening a trap door on the floor, they peered down the dark shaft of an abandoned copper mine. Nervously, they climbed 50 feet down an old wooden ladder until they reached the bottom. Lighting the candles, I led the way down a series of stone steps. The roof was very low, and the candle gave so little light that I was compelled to feel my way forward with my walking stick. I groped forward 20 or 30 feet into the caverns where the prisoners used to sleep. That was quoted in Phelps' Newgate of Connecticut. Years earlier, these cramped caves had served as Connecticut State Prison in Newgate. It was shut down in 1827. In the mid-1800s, some Americans began to condemn the way prisoners were treated. Prison reform was just one of the many movements that sprang up to cure our nation's ills. The reforming impulse. The impulse towards social reform had both political and religious roots. Social reform is an organized attempt to improve what is unjust or imperfect within a society. Political ideas, as you have read during the Jackson era, politics was becoming more democratic. More people could vote and take part in government than ever before. But still, some critics said American society was not democratic enough. They pointed to the promise of liberty and equality expressed in the Declaration of Independence. For a true democracy, they argued, would not allow slavery. Others asked why women had fewer rights than men. By changing such injustices, reform was hoped to move the nation closer to its political ideas of democracy. The Second Great Awakening during the colonial era, many American Protestants believed in predestination. According to this idea of predestination, God decided in advance which people would attain salvation after death. This belief led many people to worry that they could do nothing to be saved. In the early 1800s, a dynamic religious movement known as the Second Great Awakening swept the nation. Its leaders stressed free will rather than predestination. They taught that individuals could choose to save their souls by their own actions. And to stir religious feelings, preachers held revivals, which were huge outdoor meetings. Revivals might last for days and attract thousands of people. A witness recalled the excitement of a revival at Cane Ridge in Kentucky. The vast sea of human beings seemed to be agitated as if by a storm. I counted 7 ministers, all of them preaching at once. Some of the people were singing and others were praying. Some were crying for mercy, said James B. Finnelly in his autobiography. One leader of the Second Great Awakening was a minister named Charles Grandison Finney. He was a powerful speaker. Finney taught that individual salvation was the first step toward the complete reformation of the whole world. Such teachings inspired new efforts to improve our society. Hospital and prison reform. One of the most vigorous social reformers was Dorothea Dix. She was a Boston schoolteacher. She turned her attention to what one minister called the outsiders in society, criminals and the mentally ill. In 1841, there was reforms for the mentally ill. Dix visited a jail for women near Boston. She was outraged to discover that some of the prisoners were not criminals but mentally ill. Dix demanded to know why these women were locked in small, dark, unheated cells. The jailer replied that lunatics did not feel the cold. During the next 18 months, Dorothea Dix visited every jail, poorhouse, and hospital in the state of Massachusetts, and her shocking reports helped to persuade the state legislators to fund a new mental hospital. I proceed, gentlemen, briefly to call to your attention the present state of insane persons that are confined in cages and closets and cellars, stalls and pens. They are chained naked and beaten with rods and lashed into obedience. This is what Dorothea Dix said in her memorial to the state legislators of Massachusetts in her attempt to provide state legislators with the evidence needed to fund new mental hospitals. Dix went on to inspect jails as far away as Louisiana from her home state of Massachusetts, and she also reached out to Illinois. Her reports persuaded most legislators to treat the mentally ill as patients and not as criminals. During the prison reform, Dix also joined a growing movement to improve conditions in prisons. Men, women, children, they were all often crammed together in cold, damp rooms. When food supplies were low, prisoners went hungry unless they had money to buy from jailers. 5 out of 6 people in the northern jails were debtors, or people who could not pay money that was owed to them. While behind bars, debtors, or people who could not pay money owed to them, had no way to earn money to pay back their debt, and as a result, many of these debtors, or people who could not pay back the money they owed, remained in prison for many years. Dix and others called for changes in the prison system. As a result, some state prisons, with only 1 or 2 inmates to a cell, cruel punishments were banned, and people convicted of minor crimes received shorter sentences. Slowly, states stopped treating debtors as criminals. The temperance movement. Alcohol abuse was widespread in the early 1800s. At political rallies, weddings, and funerals, men, women, and sometimes even children drank heavily. Men could buy whiskey in candy stores or barber shops. The temperance movement, or a campaign against alcohol abuse, took shape in the late 1820s. Women often took a leading role in this battle. They knew that demon rum could lead to wife-beating, child abuse, and the breakup of families. Some temperance groups urged people to drink less, and others sought to end drinking altogether. They won a major victory in 1851 when Maine banned the sale of alcohol. 8 other states passed Maine laws. Most states later repealed the laws, but the temperance crusade would gain new strength in the late 1800s. Improving education. In 1800, few American children ever had a chance to attend school. Massachusetts was the only state that required free public schools supported by the community. Teachers were poorly trained and ill-paid, and students of all ages were crowded together in one single room. As more men won the right to vote, reformers acted to improve education. They argued that a republic required educated citizens. Growth of public schools. New York State took the lead in improving public education, and in 1814, the state passed a law requiring local governments to set up tax-supported school districts. Horace Mann became head of Massachusetts Board of Education in 1837, and he hounded legislators to provide more money for education. Under his leadership, Massachusetts built new schools, extended the school year, and raised teachers' pay. The state also opened 3 colleges to train teachers. And yes, children, if you want to be angry at anyone for starting school, it's Horace Mann. Other states followed the lead of Massachusetts and New York, and by the late 1850s, most northern states had set up free tax-supported elementary schools. Schools in the South improved more slowly, and in both the North and the South, schooling usually ended in 8th grade, and there were few public high schools. Can you imagine that? The 8th grade being your senior year of school. Education for African Americans. In most areas, African Americans had little chance to attend school. A few cities like Boston and New York had set up separate schools for black students. However, these schools received less money than schools for white students did, and in the North, African American men and women often opened their own schools to educate their own children. Some attempts to educate African Americans met with hostility, and in the 1830s, Prudence Crandall, a Connecticut Quaker, began a school for African American girls. Crandall continued to teach even as rocks smashed through the windows of a school, and finally a mob broke in one night and totally destroyed it. Despite such obstacles, some African Americans went on to attend private colleges such as Harvard, Dartmouth, and Oberlin. In 1854, Pennsylvania chartered the first college for African American men. Educating people with disabilities. Some reformers improved education for people with disabilities, and in 1817, Thomas Gaudelet set up school for the deaf in Hartford, Connecticut. Samuel Gridley Howe founded the first American school for the blind in 1832. Howe used a system of raised letters to enable students to read with their fingers. One of Howe's pupils, Laura Bridgman, was the first deaf and blind student to ever receive a formal education. And that, children, will conclude our first chapter.